Okay, good evening, everyone. Hello. So we're going to get started soon. So welcome to the Harvey B. Gantt Center for African American Arts and Culture. My name is Leandra Juliet Kelly, and I'm the Collections and Exhibitions Manager, as well as the curator for our newest exhibition, Visions, A Study of Form. Thank you. When curating this exhibition, I wanted to take it back to the fundamentals. I decided to focus on this idea of form, the physical nature of a work of art, how various elements come together to create what we see before us, and how these forms convey a sense of meaning in and of itself. While researching for this exhibition, I learned about an artist by the name of Ralph Chizé, and you will see his beautiful oil paintings in the exhibition. Chizé said, "Only man's art can tell us how he looked, how he felt, how he lived. An emotion takes on a definite form in a painting, a sculpture, works on paper, or a work of architecture. They all become the visible soul of man. They all become the visible soul of man." Chizé's words serve as the leitmotif for the exhibition, Visions, A Study of Form. The techniques employed by these artists demonstrate not only their mastery, but their approaches to capturing and illustrating sentiments, societal perspectives, and quotidian moments. Through various mediums, oil painting, collage, tapestry, figurative studies, artists encourage us to be inquisitive. Their color choices play with perception, while their layering techniques give new meaning to the idea of depth. As you explore the exhibition, I encourage you to take a moment with these works of art, a long pause, if you will. As you notice their individual elements, the colors, shapes, layers, brushstrokes, the internal meanings, the visions of both these works and their artists will begin to appear. Now to the man of the hour. Richard J. Powell is the John Spencer Bassett Professor of Art and Art History at Duke University, where he has taught since 1989. He studied at Morehouse College and Howard University before earning his doctorate in art history at Yale University. Along with teaching courses in American art, the arts of the African Diaspora, and contemporary visual studies, he has written extensively on topics ranging from primitivism and postmodernism, including such titles as Homecoming, The Art and Life of William H. Johnson, and Black Art, A Cultural History, which he will be signing copies of later tonight. Dr. Powell is a recipient of the Smithsonian's Lawrence A. Fleischman Award for Scholarly Excellence in the field of American art history. He was a James S. Ackerman Scholar in Residence at the American Academy in Rome, Italy, and a visiting researcher at the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art in Paris, France. And last but not least, he is a recipient of the Gantt Center's own Spirit of the Center Award. It is a true honor to have him here tonight. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard J. Powell.
I teach, and so I've taught myself to project, but I know that the microphone is helpful as well. I don't have a lot of time because I could talk about African American art all night, and we don't have all night. So I'm going to get into my presentation. Your problem, Langston, my problem, no, our problem, is to conceive, develop, establish an art era. Not white art painted black, no. Let's bare our arms and plunge them deep through laughter, through pain, through sorrow, through hope, through disappointment, into the very depths of the souls of our people and drag forth material crude, rough, neglected. Then let's sing it, dance it, write it, paint it. Let's do the impossible. Let's create something transcendentally material, mystically objective, earthy, spiritually earthy, dynamic. Those are the words of Aaron Douglas. You can't tell me artists aren't intellectuals. You can't tell me artists don't think deeply and profoundly. Here is this young man who comes from the Midwest. He's writing his buddy Langston Hughes, who he has just met. And he's moved by Langston Hughes, and he says, we have a project. We now call that project the Harlem Renaissance. But in that era, Aaron Douglas didn't have a word for it other than to call it, let's create something transcendentally material, mystically objective, earthy, spiritually earthy, dynamic. We are so blessed in North Carolina to have one of the works created from that moment by Aaron Douglas. This is his Congo, a beautiful drawing that he created along with several other drawings for a publication called Black Magic. I think it was actually translated from the French Magie Noire. We're also blessed to have this incredible painting, also on view at the North Carolina Museum of Art, but from the collection of Bennett College, and it's a tribute to Harriet Tubman. I mean, think about it. Aaron Douglas was in his 20s and was kind of fresh out of art school. He had studied with Winold Reiss, the very important German modernist artist in New York City. And from 1925, when he wrote that letter, into the early 30s, he's churning out these incredible, powerful, evocative, fresh works of art. Works that he calls materially objective, earthy, mystical. And when we see this image, and you gotta see it, it's on view at the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh presently, you can really understand how Aaron Douglas has taken the ideas of modernism, he's taken the ideas of spiritualism, that he receives from some intellectuals and mystics in New York during that time period. And then he applies them to trying to tell the story of African American history. In this particular instance, the story of Harriet Tubman, this incredible woman who works her way back and forth across the South to the North, bringing her enslaved sisters and brothers with her. I said I was going to do something special for AJ, and I didn't know I was going to meet AJ from Florence, South Carolina, but since tomorrow is William Henry Johnson's birthday, I wanted to do a tribute to this amazing African-American artist from Florence, South Carolina, who had studied in New York at the American Academy of Design, who also worked with Charles Hawthorne in Cape Cod and Provincetown, and then he goes to France, and then he goes to Scandinavia, and then he goes to Tunisia, and then he comes back to New York, and he creates these amazing paintings, and people in Florence just had no idea that this little colored boy was going to be this extraordinary, important modernist. But he's interviewed in Denmark in 1932, and he says, my aim is to express in a natural way what I feel, what is in me, both rhythmically and spiritually, all that which in time has been saved up in my family of primitiveness and tradition, and which is now concentrated in me. He does this interview. It's got this amazing Danish title, Today's Interview, with an Indian and black blood in his vein. The Chinos painter, William H. Johnson, speaks a little bit about his African journeys, primitive art, etc., etc., etc. And when I saw the works, Leandra, of Ralph Chessy, I was amazed that this work really coordinates with so many of the ideas that William H. Johnson was exploring during these years in the 1940s upon his arrival back to the United States. This painting, Elijah and the Ravens, a surprise for me. Again, I had no knowledge of Ralph Chessy, but when I looked at these works in reproduction and when you see them in the galleries, you'll realize that this is an artist who, like Johnson, is operating from his family of primitiveness and tradition. And another really important artist working in these 40s, and the 40s is actually an amazing period in the kind of annals of African American art. People often zoom in on the Harlem Renaissance or they zoom in on the 1960s, but the mid-century was a moment when artists are really grappling and trying to make by an incredible artist called Slow Down Freight Train. She was inspired by the blues. She was in conversation with Hale Woodruff, who's in the exhibition in the gallery here at the Gantt. And she got a Rosenwald Fellowship to travel throughout the South and to absorb blues culture, black culture, and to make that into something visual. And so we have in this great painting this kind of image of, it's almost like somebody is witnessing a train car roll by a la Romy Bearden. And, but she's reduced it to these kind of bold, solid colors, very much like Ralph Chessy, very much like William H. Johnson. This is kind of a mode of painting with heavy impasto paint that a lot of people are working with during this time period to evoke what Johnson calls "in my family of primitiveness and tradition." During the summer of 1963, at a time of crucial metamorphosis, just before the now historic March on Washington, a group of Negro artists met to discuss their position in American society and to explore other common problems. One of those present, the distinguished painter Hale Woodruff, asked the question, "Why are we here?" He suggested in answering his own question that we as Negroes could not fail to be touched by the outrage of segregation, or fail to relate to the self-reliance, hope, and courage of those persons who were marching in the interests of man's dignity. In examining ourselves, we soon realized we were also examining the present health of a wounded American society as well as much of Western culture. Despite many varying viewpoints, the members of this group felt they had something definitive and positive to affirm. If possible, we hope with our art to justify life. As a symbol for the group, we chose a spiral, a particular kind of spiral, the Archimedean one, because from a starting point, it moves outward, embracing all directions, yet constantly upward. This is a quote from an exhibition publication in the mid-1960s. And as some of you who know your Romy Bearden kind of histories, you know that Romy Bearden was deeply connected and deeply engaged in this group spiral. And in many respects, the spiral group helps generate and create the work that has become definitively Romy Bearden. Like this amazing collage down the road at Davidson College, evening 9:10, 461 Lenox Avenue. I'm intrigued with the fact that Romy decides to call this work with time and an address. So he kind of gives us something very perfunctory, you know, these facts of place, these facts about time, and then we have this image that's fractured, that's cut up out of old newspapers and magazines, Ebony magazine, Jet magazine, National Geographic, and they assemble this memory that is both vivid and imagined by Romy Bearden of life in the South. And another member of Spiral who's key and central to this whole story is Hale Woodruff. Originally from Indianapolis, Indiana, studied at the John Herron Institute in Indianapolis, is a recipient of a major grant that allows him to go to France in the 1920s, and works in Atlanta University in the 30s and 40s, also works as a muralist, and works at New York University in the 60s until his death around 1980. And it's in the 60s that he says, I'm an abstract painter. I'm someone who, on one hand, as we saw in that great quote, I'm interested in the struggles of black people circa 1965, but I'm also deeply engaged in creating an artwork that can speak to that in not a literal way, in not a way that is a storytelling way, but in an evocative way, in some ways hearkening back to Aaron Douglas's statement about being mystically objective. So in a work like Celestial Gates, circa 1965-68, on view here at the Gantt, one can see him kind of mapping out and thinking about symbols and designs and motifs from Africa, but applying those with vivid colors and shapes and forms that really speak to contemporary abstract painting in those years. I just have to read this, and I have to kind of get into my Black Arts Movement mode. The expressive awesomeness that one experiences in African art and life in the U.S., like the Holiness Church, which is about as close to home as we are in this country, and the demon that is the blues, Alcinder's dunk and Sayer's cut, the hip walk and the together talk, symmetry that is free, repetition with change, based on African music and African movement, the rhythm that is easy, syncopation, and very, very human, uncontracted. Images that mark the spot where the real and the overreal, the plus and the minus, the abstract and the concrete, the real and the replete meet. Mimesis. Color. 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 Color that shines. Color that is free of rules and regulations. Color that is expressively awesome. Color that defines, identifies, and directs. Super real color for super real images, the super reality that is our everyday, all day thing. Color as bright and as real as the colors dealing on the streets of Watts and the South Side and 4th Street and in Roxbury and in Harlem, in Abidjan, in Port-au-Prince, Bahia, Ibadan, in Dakar and Johannesburg, and everywhere we are. Kool-Aid colors for Kool-Aid images, for the super real people, super real images for super real people. Jeff Donaldson wrote that manifesto in 1970. And it was very much tied and connected to the group that he was engaged with, this group called Afrocobra. And so we move from the 60s and this kind of open-endedness with celebrations of abstraction and openness in terms of the collage with Romy Bearden and Hale Woodruff to artworks like Barclay Hendrix's Dixwell. Now, as Leandra said, I did my undergraduate degree at Morehouse. I did my MFA at Howard, and I worked for a number of years, and then I ended up working on a master's in African American Studies and a PhD at Yale, so I found myself in New Haven, Connecticut. I had never really lived in New England before, and I wasn't quite ready for what I was going to engage with there. But I realized that even in New England, there was a black community, and that black community revolved around this street, Dixwell. And I didn't realize that before me in New Haven was this extraordinary artist named Barclay Hendrix. And Barclay studied in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He had also studied at the School of Art at Yale University. And in the same time period that Jeff Donaldson is talking about expressively awesome black art and colors, Barclay is creating these extraordinary portraits of black people. And when you turn on Turner Classic Movies and watch Coffee with Pam Grier or Shaft with Richard Roundtree, you'll see what I'm talking about in terms of the Afro explosions and the suits made out of polyester, bell-bottom pants, platform shoes. They're back in fashion again. And so Barclay was picking up on this kind of new energy, this new fashion energy that black people are engaged with. And he creates this painting, and it's at North Carolina Central University in Durham. And when my wife and I arrived in Durham, we had no idea we were going to encounter this amazing masterpiece by Barclay Hendricks, a work that had been collected by Mr. and Mrs. Clyde Deloche Riles. Mrs. Riles, Hildegard, had worked for years at the Philadelphia Museum. I'm guessing she saw his work in Philadelphia. But think of it, this is an art form that is connected to the Italian Renaissance, the tondo, this circular form that often incorporates the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus. And he has moved from that old world approach to painting to this very hip brother with his big hat on and his red and blue knit shirt, smoking something. And thanks to the Gantt again, we have this extraordinary work from the same time period by Alvin Hollingsworth, a work entitled Family Tree. From 1977. And again, it speaks to this energy that Jeff Donaldson is trying to articulate and describe for us in his poetic and creative way. I love how Al Hollingsworth, a New York-based artist, really kind of ramps up colors here. This kind of insistent ochre yellow that Cossett's blue and red, and these figures that on one hand might remind us of something that we would see in the work of a Hale Woodruff, but actually take us someplace else as well. A few years ago, my friend, the artist Glenn Ligon, and I began using the term post-black. Post-black was shorthand for post-black art, which was shorthand for a discourse that could fill volumes. For me, to approach a conversation about black art ultimately meant embracing and rejecting the notion of such a thing at the very same time. At the end of the 90s, Glenn and I began more and more to see evidence of art and ideas that could only be labeled both ironically and seriously in this way: post-black. It was a clarifying term that had ideological and chronological dimensions and repercussions. It was characterized by artists who were adamant about not being labeled as black artists, though their work was steeped, in fact, deeply interested in redefining complex notions of blackness. In the beginning, there were only a few marked instances of such an outlook. But at the end of the 1990s, it seemed that post-black had fully entered into the art world's consciousness. Post-black was the new black. So this is a quote, as you can see, by Thelma Golden. And it was Thelma reflecting on a conversation that she was having with Glenn Ligon at the end of the 1990s about this new art that's emerging in the art world. Works that kind of royal in complexity and contradictions. Works by African American artists who on one hand were very proud of their histories and their lineages, but at the same time felt that they wanted their work to do more and to problematize and to critique and to trouble easy, comfortable notions of race and identity and culture. And at Duke, my home institution, one of the pieces that when I walk through the galleries and I always think about this idea of post-black is this amazing large photograph by Mickaleen Thomas, lovely 6-footer, lovely 6-footer. And part of the reason why this work is so near and dear to me, it really, in some ways, is a kind of a hearkening back, or at least a response to Barclay Hendricks's Dixwell, because Barclay Hendricks is painting in the 1970s moment. But Mickaleen Thomas is responding to that nostalgic black arts movement moment with these wonderful interiors, these afro hairstyles, these patterns on top of patterns, these rooms where people's albums are piled up. Thelma Golden, Diana Ross, Thelma Houston, I'm sorry, Diana Ross, etc. And also works that trouble and problematize notions of gender and sexuality, as so many artists beginning perhaps earnestly in the 1990s and onward are engaged with. That's a piece that I see and I engage with all the time at Duke. This is a work that again, at Davidson College by William Villalongo is called Float Like a Butterfly, Sting Like a Bee. We know that Muhammad Ali phrase from the 1960s or 70s, I guess. This is a work using that same title, but as you can see, let me get on this side so you can see it even better. It's a work that really playfully throws into this amazing scaled object, African art, the Muhammad Ali fist, the everlast helmet that boxers often incorporate, on their bodies. And then there are these butterflies, these strange creatures kind of floating around. It's almost as if William Villalongo is thinking about history and thinking about tradition and thinking about heroes. But instead of doing it in a very conventional way, it's almost as if he has this black hole, and he's throwing all these objects in that hole, and he's mixing them up and then spilling them out and throwing them on the canvas for us to engage with. So I rushed through that because I don't have what's my time like? Am I okay? Okay. Well, then I think I have time for questions and comments. I can go back over some of these images. But what I wanted to do for you today was simply to kind of walk you through African American modern art history, the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. And I wanted to give you quotes by artists, by intellectuals, by figures who really are a part of this story, but in a way to kind of frame the artworks that are created in these times, to kind of help us to understand these transitions, these visions, to use Leandra's, the title of her wonderful, wonderful show, to really give you a sense of how artists are very much connected to the moments in which they produce, and as a result, tell us not just about their own minds and what they're thinking about, but they're really reflecting on us as fellow journeyers and travelers through time. And that's why I love what I do. Thank you. I think I'm supposed to do questions and comments now. Yes.
Thank you so much for driving here, especially in the rain. We really appreciate it, and this has been fantastic. You were talking about all the different movements, and I was curious if we're still in post-Black now, or if there is a new movement that we're part of. Thank you.
That's a really good question. And it's a scary question for a scholar, because I don't want to be put on record, saying, it's this and it's that, What I will say, though, is that I was in Los Angeles last weekend, and I saw some amazing work by a whole array of interesting artists. And I would have to say that this is a very interesting moment that we're in right now. And I think one of the things that maybe Thelma is kind of acknowledging, even within the enigma of post-Black, is that not only is post-Black the new Black, post-Black is commodity. Post-Black is marketable. Post-Black is expensive, is chic. It's where it's at. And so that when you go to New York, when you go to Los Angeles, every other gallery and every other museum that claims to be, like the stuff, has to have Mark Bradford, has to have Henry Taylor, has to have Mickalene Thomas on their walls. And so this is a really fascinating moment, because in all those previous periods, African American artists have had to struggle so much to get their foot in the door, to be seen and appreciated. But this is a moment where there is a real broad-based fascination and intrigue with not just black images, but black image makers. And these are fairly broad-based image makers, not just figurative people, but people working in abstraction, people working conceptually, etc. So post-black has morphed even from the 90s when Thelma Golden tries to describe it for us, she and Glenn Ligon. It has become something else, and we may want to call it that, or we might want to call it something else. I'm not quite sure what that is yet, but we'll see.
Hi, my name is Mike McCarthy, and I just have a question piggybacking off of the post-black. Now I'm seeing some of the well-known auction galleries that's classifying our African-American art as outsiders. And it's the same art that you have here, so how can you elaborate on that, is where we're seeing the word outsiders that's associated with our black art?
Okay, thank you for that question. I teach a course at Duke called Outsiders and Insiders. And I've taught it for several years now, and the idea of the course is that at any given moment in the art world, in a cultural scene, you have people who are in, meaning people who seem to be really kind of connected to the energy, to the zeitgeist of the world of art. And then you have people who are not a part of that, who are viewed as, for lack of a better or a more sophisticated term, outsiders. And one of the things that I've learned over the course of teaching this course is that these are categories that are not static. These are categories that move and float and change, and people who at one point were in are out, and some folks who were out are now in. And it speaks to, I think, just the kind of the fluidity and the changes and the flexibility of culture and taste. And I don't think there's a better way to kind of phrase it or to try to answer your question. I will say that in terms of African American artists, we've been outside for a long time. I mean, we can go back to Aaron Douglas's moment, the Harlem Renaissance. For all of the beautiful, great, fantastic works that he created, he was not at the level of some of the other major artists of that period because he was black and because he didn't have access to the circles, the worlds that one needed to be a part of to be successful. We can even flash forward to the 1960s with Romy Bearden, who emerges as this extraordinary collage artist and gets this great major exhibit at MoMA in the early 1970s. That was an outlying phenomena of that moment. And so African American artists know what it means to be on the outs. I remember having a really interesting conversation with Kerry James Marshall years ago about time and about careers and black artists. And one of the things that came out of the conversation, at least from my point of view, that I thought was really important to stress is that, and it kind of goes back to post-black and commodity and money, is that the William H. Johnsons of the world who lived on the Lower East Side or in the Village, painting on burlap, painting on cardboard that he found on the streets, he wasn't making any money, but he was working because he had to. And what I mean by he had to is that it was in him, to create, because that was in his heart and that was in his soul. And there were a few people who recognized his genius and his talent, but for the most part, they did not recognize his genius and his talent. And the story that many of you know is that he ends up in a state mental hospital. He stays there for years. He dies, and the works almost get thrown out. But were it for a few enlightened people who said this guy was a genius, and they saved those pieces, and now those works are incredibly valuable and appreciated. And in terms of historical American art, he's in. So I guess my response, again, to your question, and I don't know if I'm successful with it or not, but I'll just say that these terms, have temporary meaning, and that I think part of what one has to constantly remember is that artists, for the most part, work because they have to, and they create, and hopefully those talents are recognized during their lifetimes. Often, and sadly, that isn't the case. But one hopes that there'll be enough eyes and there'll be enough minds to realize genius and talent where it lies, whether it's somebody who is connected to the art schools like Yale. I mentioned all these Yale people up here, or people who never went to an academy or an art school, but just worked at their kitchen table and produced great and extraordinary works. That was long, I'm sorry. I think we've got someone in the back, yeah.
Hey, thank you for your time today, Doctor.
Okay.
I could ask 11 questions, but I'm gonna settle on one. It seems like in our community, a lot of times, my son's 9, and a lot of kids don't seem like they veer toward art or go toward art. I would be interested to know what, when, how, where, just a little bit about your story. How did you get to knowing that you were so passionate? Was it at an early age? Just a little bit, if you could give a backstory on that.
Okay, thank you. I grew up in Chicago. My family, they were not affluent. They were working people. But I would say that one of the blessings of growing up in Chicago when I grew up was an appreciation for culture. My father would take me all the time to the Art Institute of Chicago, the Museum of Science and Industry. Whenever I had a whim to draw or to paint, I got all the crayons and paper that I needed. I was fortunate enough to live in a neighborhood where we were close to the University of Chicago, so I was able to go to art fairs, and I went to art fairs on a regular basis. We had people in our community who were artists, and some of them knew they were artists, but many people didn't know they were artists, but we knew they were creative, and they were appreciated, and I had exposure to them, and that I think was really important coming up and growing up. Going to high school, we really didn't have art classes at the Catholic high school that I went to, but I pursued and continued the work that I continued to work with and to engage with. I think there's always been kind of an art streak in me. I don't think that, yes, you can nurture it, but sometimes I think it's just there, and it just kind of comes out in amazing ways. And for me, it was never just about the visual. I always loved writing, and I always loved literature, and I loved theater and dance and music. And so all of those things I got even before going to college. And so when I got to Morehouse, Atlanta was a very special place in the 1970s, but I would say I was already imprinted with the art bug. And of course, I didn't know what a curator or what an art historian was during that time period. I was totally dedicated to art making. But I think as I grew older, I began to realize that the art world is not just made up of makers. The art world is also made up of theorists and people who think about art and write about art and critique art. There are people who sell art and promote and patronize artists. So I realized that there was this bigger world of art that again, moved beyond makers into support and advocates and scholars. And I just moved into that area, I have to say, thanks to friends and colleagues and being exposed to people who showed me this wider world. I think that being at Howard in the 70s was also very transformative for me. The Chocolate City in the 70s was really ground zero for Black culture. I met, when I was a student at Howard, I met Nina Simone during those years. I hung out with Jeff Donaldson. I met all sorts of amazing writers like Alice Walker and Ntozake Shange and James Baldwin. So being at a Black institution like Howard in those years opened my eyes to the possibilities of what was in the world in terms of art. And so I just kind of followed my path. I was very lucky to have parents who said, well, as long as you can take care of yourself and you're happy doing what you do, just go ahead and do it. I wasn't put on the doctor track or the lawyer track or the business track. And so I was very grateful for that. Like I said, my folks didn't come from resources. I think they just thought it was important that I be happy and that I follow my passions and that I do what I want to do well.
I came late. Oh, thank you. I came to the event late, but I'm just curious, how were you received at Duke University? You know, as a professor there, being Black and being in art, that's something that typically people don't think of Blacks and being in that, and to be at a conservative institution like Duke University. I want to know how you were received.
Well, my story for Duke goes back before I got to Duke. I was a student at Yale working on my PhD in art history, and my advisor, Robert Ferris Thompson, who probably was one of the most important scholars of African art and the arts of the African diaspora of the 20th century, pulled me aside one day and said, you know, I have a colleague at Duke University who needs somebody to do an appraisal of their African art collection. And would you do it? I said, sure. And so I flew to Durham. This would have been around 1983. And I met a gentleman by the name of John Spencer. And John Spencer had been he was a graduate of Yale, because all those Yaleys, they're like, it's like a mafia. And he had studied Italian Renaissance. He was also interesting, though, because he was very close to Nancy Hanks. And I don't know if you all know the politics and the culture connections to North Carolina, but Nancy Hanks worked under Richard Nixon and was was the first director of the National Endowment for the Arts. And I'm always fascinated that this major initiative to support artists across the United States was first done under a Republican administration and from under Richard Nixon of all people. But John Spencer had worked with Nancy Hanks, I guess, early on in after she left North Carolina and New York. Anyway, he was the director of this museum at Duke. And he brought me in, and I looked at the collection, and I said, okay, this is interesting. I had no idea that this was going to be in my future. And so this is really a message to young people. You don't know who you meet and who you will connect to, who are going to connect you to somebody 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the line. So anyway, I go ahead and do my PhD. I get married. I'm living in Washington, D.C. And then I get a call from John Spencer saying, I hope you remember me when you did that evaluation of the African art collections. You know, we're doing an initiative at Duke to try to bring in Black faculty. It was called the Black Faculty Initiative. This was happening in the the late 1980s. And they remembered me. And I said, sure, I'll come down and do an interview. I was in D.C. at that point. And I guess the interview went well. They offered me a job, and I had just gotten married, so I needed to make some money. and I brought my wife kicking and screaming from D.C. to Durham, North Carolina. And so that began my career at Duke. But I also want to add that this is a moment at Duke when not only do they have this Black faculty initiative, but they're trying to bring in a whole bunch of other Black faculty. And one of the people who was there as I just arrived is Henry Louis Gates, and that's a whole nother story. I can't even get into that story because I had known him like for at least a decade before that. And also, by the time I got there, he was already on his way out, leaving Duke to go to Cornell, and then to go, or was it Cornell? Anyway, he ended up at Harvard, you know. But there were other Black faculty there who embraced me and supported me and welcomed me. And there were white faculty there who embraced me and supported me and welcomed me and basically said, we believe in what you're doing, and you just need to do what you do and continue doing what you're doing, and we'll support you in those endeavors. And that meant a lot to me. And I was also a part of a department and a division at Duke, the humanities, that was transforming itself. I don't know if this is, I'm really getting into the weeds of academe, but this is a moment with Duke that Duke has become the centerpiece of critical theory. A whole bunch of intellectuals and scholars who have made a name for themselves are ending up in all places in Durham, North Carolina. Now, I don't even consider myself a part of that group, but maybe some of it rubbed off on me in terms of wanting to think critically and seriously about African American art and culture. So that began my career there, and it's gotten better in terms of more faculty joining and becoming part of the community. In this interim period, the Nasher Museum of Art opens, which was a boon to my scholarship and my research. One of the great things about the Nasher is that we have this young board of people who are seriously connected. As I showed you, a number of these works are in our collection. You know, being a new kid on the block, I mean, the Nasher didn't open until 2005, but so they couldn't buy old stuff, but they were buying Carol Walker and Kehinde Wiley and Glenn Ligon and really, really important cutting-edge contemporary African-American art. So as my wife always reminds me, you work where you work and you live where you live. And so I've made a home there, and I've made a home in North Carolina, and I've continued to do what I do. And I don't know if that answers your question. Okay. Yeah, I think we have one more. Yeah.
I'm considered an outside
Please use
artist.
the microphone, please. Yeah.
I hate these things. I'm considered an outside artist because I'm one of the untrained persons. Where do we belong now?
Well, you are with us, and you have always been with us. And I'll just elaborate just a little bit more. Being a person of color almost means outsiderness, sui generis. And what I mean by that is that mainstream society doesn't realize the genius and the brilliance and the fun of growing up in, as Jeff Donaldson said, in Watts, in Roxbury, on the south side of Chicago, in Port-au-Prince, in Johannesburg, in Abidjan. In other words, we are all ultimately outsiders in a society that doesn't celebrate and privilege and love black bodies. And so what we do is that we continue to be activists and demand for being more immersed in American society. But we also celebrate who we are. And we also celebrate all the genius and the creativity of what we have produced. And so it's not an either or. It's, I am American and I am African American and I'm an artist and I celebrate our culture and we can do it all. It's not a divvying up and you put one here and you put one there. So you are us and we are you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that amazing talk. Let's give another round. So you're able to view the exhibition Visions, a Study of Form on our third floor. And then also on the third floor, Dr. Powell will be signing copies of his book, A Black Art, A Cultural History, which you can purchase right here. And then also the fourth floor, there'll be a closing reception there where you can grab food and drink and enjoy the city views. So there's a lot to do this evening. And as always, thank you so much for coming to the Harvey B. Gantt Center and enjoy.